I woke up before the alarm clock, as always, with that uncomfortable feeling that the day was already tired. The ceiling of the room had been the same for decades, but it seemed more and more distant, as if I was cowering inside my own house. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight on my knees and something harder to name on my chest. No one needed to tell me I was old. The world did this in small daily gestures. Still, I kept going, because following was all I had left. Routine was my last safe territory, or at least I believed it was. In the kitchen, I prepared coffee the way I always did, even though I knew that no one else would drink it with me. The coffee maker bubbled in an almost offensive silence, interrupted only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. My children said that that watch was too old, that I should change it for something more modern. I never changed it. He marked time the way I understood it, without haste, without pressure. As the coffee passed, I thought about how everything around me seemed a little out of place, even though nothing had really changed. I sat down at the small table, the one that had previously seemed too big for me alone. I held the cup with both hands, as if it could anchor me there. I remembered when that table was always full of voices, laughter, and discussions. Now it only served to confirm what I already knew, but avoided admitting it. I had become a detail, something that was there out of habit, not choice. And yet, no one ever asked me if I was okay with it. They assumed I was. My son said that I needed to rest more, that I shouldn't worry about certain things. He spoke to me as if I were a distracted child, unable to understand the world around him. Sometimes he smiled as he spoke, which made it all the more painful. A smile can be the most polite way to disregard someone. I answered little, more out of fatigue than agreement. Inside me, something tightened, but I pushed it to the bottom. That's how I survived. After breakfast, I walked around the house slowly, touching the furniture as if confirming its own existence. Each object had a story that no one else seemed interested in hearing. Photographs on the shelves, crooked paintings, small marks on the floor. All that was part of me, but in their eyes it seemed just accumulated stuff. They had already suggested changes, reforms, even a definitive change. They said it was for my good. Always for my good. Never for what I really wanted. I sat in the armchair in the living room and stood there, watching the light come in through the window. It was at this time that the phone used to ring, but that day it remained silent. Not that this was new. The absence of calls had become commonplace, almost comfortable. I told myself that silence was peace, although I knew it was more like abandonment. Still, there was something different in the air, a restlessness that could not be explained, as if the day was holding its breath. I picked up an old book to reread, but I couldn't get past the first page. The words shuffled before my eyes, not from lack of vision, but from overthinking. I felt a twinge of fear for no clear reason, the kind of fear that is born before reason. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't know exactly who. The list was too short to offer comfort. I put the book aside and stared at my own hands, marked by time and by choices I made believing them to be right. I remembered how many times I trusted without question, how many decisions I let others make for me. It wasn't all at once. It was gradually, almost gently, an advice here, a help there, until my opinion became optional. I let myself be convinced that it was easier that way. Maybe it was, but ease comes at a price, and I was beginning to suspect that I was about to cover mine. At that moment, however, I still didn't know how. When I heard the key turning in the door, my heart raced in a strange way. It was not the usual visiting hours, and no one had told him that he would come. I stood up slowly, feeling a knot form in my stomach. The sound of the door opening echoed through the house like a warning I couldn't interpret. I took a deep breath, trying to look calm, trying to be who they expected me to be. Someone easy, docile, predictable. I still didn't know that day wouldn't allow that. As I walked towards the hallway, I had a clear feeling that something was about to change. It was not hope, nor relief. It was a heavy, almost physical premonition, as if the ground was about to give way under my feet. For a moment, I wished to return to the breakfast table, to the safe silence of routine, but it was too late. The forgetfulness that surrounded me was beginning to break, and I still had no idea what would emerge in its place. The fact that you're here, choosing to hear this story so far, says a lot about who you are. What follows isn't just a personal account. It's a truth that crosses families, time, and silences that many people live but few have the courage to face. If you believe that stories like this need to continue to be told, subscribe to the channel and help me keep alive narratives that, deep down, are also about you. They entered without asking permission, as if the house was not already exactly mine. My son came forward, with that same restrained smile he always wore when he wanted to appear calm. Behind him, my daughter kept her arms crossed, avoiding my eyes. The air was immediately heavy, and I knew, even before any words, that this visit was not accidental. There was an uncomfortable urgency to their steps, something too rehearsed to be spontaneous. I closed the door slowly, feeling that my every move was being watched. I didn't know it yet, but my routine had just been uprooted. We sat in the room like polite strangers, separated by a low table that had never seemed so big. My son started talking about concern, care, responsibility. He used soft words to wrap up something hard, almost cutting. She said that I had been forgotten, that maybe I was no longer dealing well with everyday things. As he spoke, I wondered when exactly I had ceased to be trustworthy in their eyes. I didn't remember asking for help, much less to have authorized that type of conversation. My daughter finally opened her purse and took out some papers, placing them on the table with excessive care. He said it was just a formality, something to facilitate decisions in the future. The word future sounded strange, as if it no longer included me. I leaned over to look at the documents, but my son was quicker, picking them up lightly. He said I didn't have to worry about details. That hit me harder than any scream. It was not concern that they showed, it was control. I felt my face heat up, a mixture of indignation and incredulity. I asked directly what was happening, and for a second there was silence. A revealing silence. One of those that say more than any explanation. My son took a deep breath and talked about medical decisions, about safety, about protecting my assets. Each sentence seemed carefully rehearsed, as part of a larger speech. I heard everything, but something inside me began to scream that there was more there. Much more. When I heard the word guardianship, the ground seemed to move away from my feet. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a warning. They had gone too far to turn back. They said it was temporary, preventive, necessary. I looked at those faces so familiar and at the same time, so distant, trying to recognize where I had gone wrong. At what point did I become a problem to be managed? My heart was pounding, but my voice came out low, almost too controlled for the storm that was growing inside me. I got up from the armchair with difficulty, more because of the emotional load than because of the body. He said he needed some time to think, but they exchanged a quick glance, as if that wasn't in the plans. My son tried to calm me down, put his hand on my arm, and I withdrew it with firm gentleness. That simple gesture seemed to have more meaning than all the words spoken so far. For the first time, I saw a flash of irritation on his face. The mask was beginning to slip. I went to the room to breathe, feeling my legs weak, but my mind absurdly clear. Something was wrong from the beginning, and now it was shameless. They were not there to talk. They were there to communicate a decision already made. I leaned against the dresser and closed my eyes for a moment, trying to organize my thoughts. The feeling of betrayal had no name yet, but it already hurt. I knew that, from that day on, nothing would ever go back to its place. When I returned to the room, they were already standing up, saying that they would be back soon to settle everything calmly. That calm no longer belonged to me. I nodded without answering, watching them leave as if watching strangers cross an invisible border. As soon as the door closed, silence fell over the house with an almost unbearable weight. I sat up again, feeling my hands tremble, not from fear, but from something deeper, an old indignation, forcibly awakened. I spent the rest of the day walking around the house without really being anywhere. Each object seemed to look back at me, like mute witnesses of what had just happened. I mentally repeated every phrase, every gesture, trying to find loopholes, contradictions. It didn't make sense. I knew that. And the more I thought, the clearer I became that there was something being hidden from me. It wasn't just about care. It was about power. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling for hours. The foreboding of the beginning of the day now had form, weight, and intention. I had been pushed out of life itself without warning, and it hadn't happened by accident. I promised myself in silence that I would not accept everything without understanding. They thought I was fragile, confused, incapable. Little did they know that at that moment something in me was awakening, and that the oblivion they imposed on me was finally beginning to break. They returned 2 days later, as if that break had been a gesture of kindness. I knew it wasn't. I recognized the pattern too late, but I did. This time, they brought more papers, more ready-made phrases, and less patience to pretend to be careful. My son came in talking too loudly, explaining the traffic, the heat, anything that avoided the real subject. My daughter went straight into the room, like someone who already knows the way and doesn't need to ask permission. That hurt me in a silent but profound way. The house was still mine, but it was no longer treated as such. We sat down again, almost in the same seats, as if we were staging a poorly disguised continuation. My son started by saying that that conversation was important, that it needed to happen in a mature way. The word mature sounded too ironic for me to ignore. He spoke looking more at the papers than at me. My daughter remained silent, but attentive, as if she was there to make sure that nothing went off script. I felt a pang of anger as I realized that everything seemed calculated, even her silence. He explained that they had spoken with a lawyer. He said this as if commenting on the climate, hoping that I would accept it without reacting. He spoke of prevention, of avoiding future problems, of facilitating processes. None of these words included my opinion. None invited me to participate. I was not called to that meeting, I was informed. And this realization hit me harder than the idea of guardianship itself. It wasn't just about legal control. It was about erasing me little by little with fabricated consent. When I tried to interrupt, he raised his hand slightly, asking me to let him finish. The gesture was polite, almost affectionate, and for that very reason revolting. I took a deep breath, feeling my face warm up again. He continued, saying that everything would be temporary, that I wouldn't lose anything really. That made me smile, a short, involuntary smile, full of incredulity. Losing the right to decide about one's own life didn't seem like a small thing to me, but no one seemed interested in what I felt. My daughter finally spoke up, saying that it was for my good, that I needed to trust them. Trust. The word has fallen among us as something worn, too repeated to still have force. I stared at her for a few seconds, trying to find in her the girl who once hugged me without reservation. What I found was someone tired, impatient, as if that conversation was just another unpleasant task of the day. This hurt more than any direct accusation, because there was no anger there, just indifference. I asked in a firmer voice than I expected, when exactly I had been deemed unfit. There was a brief discomfort, one of those moments when the truth threatens to slip away. My son looked away, said that it wasn't that I was exaggerating. Exaggerating. How many times have I heard this word throughout my life, whenever I refused to accept something unfair? She has now returned, heavier, loaded with consequences. I felt like they were trying to push me to a place where it would be hard to get out. They placed the papers in front of me again, this time without hiding them. I saw legal terms, dates, signatures. My name appeared there more times than I would like, but always as an object, never as a voice. I asked to take the documents to read calmly. My son hesitated, for a second too long to be natural, and said it wasn't necessary, that they would take care of everything. That second was enough to plant something inside me, a doubt that would not be easily silenced. I stood up before the conversation could go any further. She said she was tired, that she needed to rest. They exchanged another quick look, the kind that happens when someone gets out of control of the plan. They agreed, but on the condition that they return soon to resolve the final details. I nodded without arguing. I learned at that moment that sometimes silence is more strategic than open resistance. They needed to believe that I was giving in. I needed time. As soon as they were alone in the room, I heard low murmurs, words I could not distinguish. I didn't try to listen. He didn't need to. I already knew enough to understand that that meeting was never an invitation to dialogue. It was a cold communication of something that had been prepared for longer than I imagined. When they finally left, I closed the door carefully, resting my forehead on it for a few seconds. I felt a strange mixture of fear and clarity. Something was very wrong. I returned to the living room and stared at the papers left on the table. They had forgotten some there, or perhaps they had not found it necessary to collect them. I picked them up with steady hands, despite my racing heart. For the first time since the beginning of everything, I didn't feel small. I felt alert. I still didn't know how or where to start, but I was sure of one thing. It wouldn't end like that. Not with me accepting the role they decided to give me. After they left, the house became too big for me. The silence was not calm, it was dense, almost hostile. I walked through the rooms as if I were in an unknown place, trying to recognize something that told me it still belonged there. Each footstep echoed more than it should, and it bothered me deeply. I always liked the silence, but that day it seemed loaded with intention. I sat on the couch and stared at the closed door as if it could open again at any moment. My body was tired, but my mind refused to rest. I took the papers that had been left on the table and lined them up carefully. I didn't know exactly what to look for. I just felt that I needed to look carefully. Legal words were difficult, full of terms that seemed made to confuse. Still, something there bothered me more than the content itself. It was the certainty that all that had been prepared without me, maybe months, maybe years. I thought about how many conversations took place behind my back while I was preparing lunches, watering plants, and believing I was safe. Betrayal, I realized, doesn't always come with shouting. Sometimes it arrives in organized envelopes. I got up and went to the bedroom, opening old drawers in search of distraction, or perhaps meaning. I found stored letters, folded photos, memories of a time when my word had weight. I sat up on the bed and let the memories come without resistance. I remembered when my children were small and depended on me for everything. I decided, I protected, I organized the world around them. At some point, this was reversed without me noticing. Or maybe I realized it and chose to ignore it. The relationship with my son has always been the most difficult. He was practical, impatient, always believing he knew what was best for everyone. From a young age, I questioned my decisions with an air of superiority that I pretended not to notice. I defended him by saying that it was just his way, that deep down he cared. Now sitting there, these justifications rang hollow. Maybe I've confused control with care for too long. Maybe it was more comfortable that way. Admitting it hurt, but denying it started to hurt more. My daughter has always been quieter, more observant. I thought that brought us closer together. I thought her silence was respect, when maybe it was just distance. Thinking about it brought me a tightness in my chest that was difficult to explain. I wondered if she really agreed with all that, or if she just went with the flow out of tiredness. The doubt was cruel because there was no immediate answer, and the absence of response is usually the harshest of all. I remained there, staring at the wall, feeling the weight of choices I didn't make alone. I returned to the living room in the late afternoon, when the light began to change. It was then that I noticed an old box in the corner of the closet, almost hidden. I knew it was there, but I hadn't opened it in years. There was something symbolic about that forgetfulness, though I still didn't know exactly what. I knelt down carefully and pulled the box out. The dust rose into the air, making me sneeze, and for a second I almost gave up. But something inside me insisted to continue. I opened the box slowly, as if I could scare what was inside. I found old documents, contracts, receipts, papers that I hadn't seen in decades. I ran my fingers through them, feeling the texture of time. It wasn't nostalgia that moved me. It was a growing restlessness. I leafed through it unhurriedly, letting my eyes get used to those old letters. It was then that a specific envelope caught my eye. It was yellowed, with my name handwritten in a way that I recognized immediately. I felt my heart racing as I picked up the envelope. I didn't remember keeping it there, but I remembered perfectly the time when it was written. I opened it carefully and removed the document from inside. As I read the first few lines, something clicked inside me in an almost painful way. There were dates, signatures, terms too clear to ignore. I didn't understand everything right away, but I understood enough to know that it mattered, much more than any of them imagined. I sat on the floor itself, with the papers scattered around me. For the first time since the beginning of that situation, I didn't just feel like a victim. I felt part of history, with something concrete in my hands. The confusion began to give way to concentration. My mind worked fast, connecting memories, past conversations, small attitudes that once seemed irrelevant. Nothing was loose. Nothing was by chance. The silence that surrounded me now had another meaning. When night fell, I was still there, surrounded by documents and thoughts. Fear was still present, but it had been accompanied by something new, determination. I still didn't know exactly how to use what I had found, but I knew I was no longer completely disarmed. They had underestimated me, treated my silence as weakness. Perhaps it was time to show that silence can also be observation, and that not everything that is forgotten loses power. I spent the next morning with the document on the living room table, as if it could run away if I put it away again. The sunlight hit the yellowed paper directly, highlighting stains from time and old folds. I made coffee, but forgot to drink it. Each time my eyes scanned those lines, I felt a strange mixture of familiarity and surprise. I had read that before, many years ago, but never with the weight I now carried. At that time, it seemed like just one more role among many others. Today, it pulsated like a silent accusation. I read slowly, forcing myself not to skip anything. There were clear, objective terms that completely contradicted my children's recent speech. Dates that did not coincide with the versions they presented to me. Signatures that I immediately recognized, including mine, made in a very different context from what they were now trying to suggest. I felt a chill go up my spine when I realized how much it changed everything. It wasn't just a forgotten detail. It was a centerpiece that dismantled their entire narrative. And yet, it had been conveniently ignored. I remembered the day that document was signed. I was younger, firmer, and fully aware of what I was doing. There was no confusion, there was no doubt. Everything had been discussed clearly, with respect. The memory of that moment contrasted violently with the fragile image they were now trying to construct of me. I squeezed the paper between my fingers, feeling a pent-up anger grow. They were rewriting my history, and that document was proof that they were lying, or, at the very least, by manipulating the truth. I got up and walked around the room, rereading passages in a low voice, as if I needed to hear the words to believe it. Each sentence seemed to take on a new meaning in light of what was happening. I realized, with painful clarity, that someone had counted on me not remembering or not looking for. They counted on my passivity, on my tiredness. They underestimated my memory, my lucidity. Perhaps they believed that time had erased everything. What did not go out, however, was the record. I sat down again and began to compare the old document with the recent papers they had left behind. I put them side by side, lining up dates, noting repeated terms, subtle differences. The more I compared, the more evident the contradiction became. It was not a subjective interpretation. It was factual. Something there could not be sustained. My heart was beating fast, not with fear, but with an almost brutal clarity. They didn't just make decisions without me. They made decisions that went directly against what was formally established. I thought I'd confront them immediately, pick up the phone and demand explanations. But something made me stop. Impulsiveness had never been my ally, and now I felt I needed caution. If they had gone so far, it was because they believed they were safe. I would not reveal my discovery without understanding the full extent of the plan. I kept the document back in the envelope, but I didn't return it to the box. I put it in a drawer closer, like someone who keeps a gun nearby, even though I hope I wouldn't need to use it. Throughout the day, I observed details that had previously escaped me. An old email, a conversation remembered out of context, loose comments that now made sense. Everything seemed to point to a long, careful preparation. It was not a decision made out of recent concern. It was something thought out, matured, perhaps discussed in meetings to which I was never invited. The betrayal gained sharper, colder contours. There was no momentum there, only strategy. And it hurt in a different way. In the late afternoon, I sat down again at the table and took a deep breath. I needed to accept a hard truth. I could no longer trust blindly, not even in my own children. This realization did not come with immediate tears, but with a deep tiredness. A silent mourning for a relationship that might never have been exactly as I believed. Still, along with the pain came a strange sense of strength. I was no longer in the dark. And that changed everything. I took an old notebook and started writing down everything I remembered, everything that seemed relevant. Dates, names, conversations, sensations. I didn't want to depend only on memory, no matter how lucid I felt. I wanted to build something solid as they had done, but with the truth. Writing brought me an unexpected kind of calm. Each word put on paper seemed to organize not only the facts, but also my emotions. I was, for the first time, taking the reins again. When night came, I turned off the lights in the room and sat in the dark for a few minutes. The forgotten document was no longer just a memory of the past. It was a turning point. I knew there was still a difficult road ahead, full of confrontations and losses, but she also knew that she was no longer defenseless. They had a plan. Now, I had proof, and quietly I began to prepare for what was to come next. I woke up with the feeling that I hadn't really slept. My body rested, but my mind spent the night revisiting every detail of the document, as if afraid of forgetting it at dawn. I got up early, even before the sun came fully up, and went straight to the drawer where I had kept it. I opened the envelope with the same care as the day before, feeling an almost solemn respect for that paper. It was there, intact, as if waiting for me. I took a deep breath and sat down at the table, ready to look again, this time more rigorously. I started with the dates, something that I had only noticed superficially before. I took a pen and a pad of paper, writing down each one. I compared it with events of the time, personal memories, milestones that I knew were not wrong. The more I cross-referenced information, the more evident the discrepancy became. Some dates simply could not coexist with my children's recent narrative. It was impossible. It was not a question of interpretation, but of basic logic. My heart was beating fast, not out of anxiety, but out of confirmation. I then moved on to subscriptions. I recognized mine effortlessly, firmly, surely, very different from the image of confusion they were now trying to sell. I also recognized that of a former lawyer, someone who was always too meticulous to make trivial mistakes. That gave me a strange sense of relief. If he had signed, everything had been done correctly. I looked once again at the new documents and noticed something unsettling. A subscription was slightly different. A small thing, almost imperceptible to those who don't know it. But I knew it. I got up and went to the makeshift office in the guest room. There, I kept old folders, correspondence, forgotten copies for years. I rummaged through boxes, pulled drawers, splashing with the dust that rose. My body complained, but I didn't stop. I found other documents signed by the same person from the same period. I put everything side by side on the bed. The difference was now obvious. It wasn't gross forgery, but it wasn't coincidental either. It was adjustment. Subtle manipulation. I sat on the edge of the bed, feeling a mixture of indignation and sadness. Someone had altered the story with surgical precision, counting on the fact that I would not compare, I would not remember, I would not question. They bet on my age as weakness. They bet on fatigue, on the confidence built throughout life. I squeezed the papers between my fingers, feeling a cold anger settle in. It was not explosive. It was focused. An anger that asks for a response. I went back to the living room table and arranged everything in chronological order. The more I organized, the clearer the plan design became. It was not improvisation. It was something thought out, polished over time. Each new document seemed carefully constructed to overlap the old one, without ever quoting it directly, as if he didn't exist, as if I didn't exist in that version of the story. I swallowed hard when I realized the level of coldness involved. This wasn't just about control. It was about erasure. I thought about how they spoke to me, the words they chose, the strategic silences. It all made sense now. The hurry, the disguised irritation, the discomfort when I asked to read calmly. They knew there was something I shouldn't revisit, something that could collapse everything. And yet, they took the risk. Maybe because they believed I wasn't able to connect the dots. Maybe because they never saw me as someone who could react. This realization hurt, but it also gave me clarity. I picked up the phone and thought about calling someone outside, asking for help, confirming suspicions. My hand hovered over the screen for a few seconds, but I decided to wait. Not yet. I needed to understand everything on my own first, to build a complete picture. If I were to seek support, it would have to be at the right time with everything very well aligned. I didn't want doubts. I didn't want loopholes. I wanted the truth in its most solid form possible. They had played quietly for years. I could wait a little longer. In the late afternoon, I felt a deep tiredness, but different from other days. It was a tiredness accompanied by purpose. I knew now that I wasn't imagining things, that it wasn't exaggeration, it wasn't confusion. The dates didn't match because they were made not to match, hoping that no one would notice. She smiled to herself, a short, almost bitter smile. For the first time since it all began, I felt like I was one step ahead. They had underestimated my attention, and that I knew would be costly. The next morning, I decided to talk to my son, not because she believed he would tell the truth, but because she needed to watch his reactions. There are things that words hide, but the body delivers. I called early, pretending normality, and suggested that he stop by the house so we could talk calmly. There was a pause too short to be disinterested, too long to be spontaneous. He agreed, using that careful tone that I now recognized as a warning. I hung up, feeling a tightness in my chest, aware that this conversation would mark a point of no return. While I waited, I organized the room as I always did when he came, not for him, but for me. The order helped me to think. I put the old document in a simple folder, along with copies that I made myself that morning. I didn't intend to show them yet. I wanted to hear it first. I wanted to see how far he would go without being confronted. Trusting hurts precisely because it requires exposure, and I was about to expose myself once again. Even so, I had to try. Perhaps it was the last remnant of a mother speaking louder. He arrived in a contained hurry, kissed my face quickly, and sat down without waiting for an invitation. He asked how I was, but his eyes didn't wait for an answer. I talked about trivial things for a few minutes, watching him shift on the couch, impatient. When I changed my tone and said I was worried about those documents, he became rigid. He didn't have to say anything. His silence answered for itself. That crossed me like a painful confirmation. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. I asked directly why certain dates didn't match. He smiled, a short, rehearsed smile, and said that I must be confusing old roles. He said that this was normal, that I didn't need to worry. The way he spoke to me, too slow, too didactic, made me feel small for a moment. But soon came the indignation. I knew what I had seen. I knew how to read. And above all, I knew how to remember. The problem was not my memory. It was his version. When I mentioned the name of the former lawyer, he looked away for the first time. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. I asked him if he remembered him, and the answer came evasively, full of beating around the bush. He said that that was beside the point, that the important thing was the present. The present. Always the present. As if the past had no legal, moral, emotional weight. At that moment, I realized that he was not there to clarify anything. I was there to measure how much I knew, and that chilled me inside. I felt like screaming, throwing everything on the table and demanding explanations. But I restrained myself. Instead, I said that I needed time to think, that I didn't feel comfortable signing anything for now. The change in his face was immediate. Patience dissolved, giving way to barely concealed irritation. He spoke of deadlines, consequences, necessity. Each word sounded more like a threat than a caution. That was not the son I raised. Or maybe it always had been, and I refused to see. When he left, I felt a physical pain in my chest, as if something had been forcibly torn away. Trusting him had been natural all my life. Questioning him now seemed like a betrayal on my part, even though I knew he was the one who betrayed me. This inversion made me dizzy, emotionally exhausted. I cried for the first time since the beginning of everything, sitting alone in the room, not bothering to look strong. It was a contained, silent cry, loaded with years of concessions. After the tears ceased, something in me reorganized. The conversation had been painful but enlightening. I could no longer pretend that there was room for naivety. My son was not confused. He was determined, and that made everything more dangerous. I got up, washed my face, and went back to the table. I opened the notebook and added every detail of the conversation, every pause, every look away. Confidence had hurt, but he had also taught me. That night, as I closed the curtains and turned off the lights, I felt a different loneliness. It wasn't just being alone in the house, it was being alone in fact. But interestingly, this did not weaken me. On the contrary, if I was alone, I had to rely only on myself, and I was beginning to understand that this might be enough. They had counted on my love to keep me quiet. They did not count on the moment when loving would no longer be synonymous with obeying. The next morning, I woke up different. It no longer alerts by fear, but awakens by something firmer. There was a quiet clarity in me, as if all the pieces were finally laid out on the table. I made my coffee calmly. I sat at the same table as always, but I no longer felt small there. The space seemed different, because I was different. They saw me as fragile, confused, manipulable. This image, I realized, was precisely what gave me the advantage. While they believed I was cornered, I began to move. I spent hours organizing everything I had gathered. Old documents, recent papers, notes, souvenirs. I separated by dates, by names, by context. Every detail fitted in was a silent affirmation that I was still capable. He didn't do it out of revenge, but out of dignity. It was strange to realize how easily I was underestimated, as if age had erased my intelligence. They mistook my silence for ignorance. In fact, it has always been observation. I decided to leave the house that day, something I hadn't done in a while without telling anyone. I went to a stationery store and bought new folders, labels, a better notebook. The simple act of choosing it on my own gave me a forgotten sense of autonomy. No one called me asking where I was. No one worried. This absence confirmed something painful, but also liberating. I no longer needed to live up to expectations that were never mine. When I returned, I sat down again and reread the old document with even more attentive eyes. I noticed details that had previously gone unnoticed. A specific clause, written in a clear, direct way, impossible to ignore. It completely nullified the discourse they had been trying to impose on me. I felt a slight tremor in my hands, not from fear, but from impact. That wasn't just defense. It was an attack. It was proof that their plan had a serious crack. A crack that only I seemed to have noticed. I thought about how many times I heard that I no longer kept up with things, that the world had become too fast for me. It was true that a lot had changed, but principles do not grow old. Signed papers do not lose value because someone decides to ignore them. Justice does not depend on age. The more I thought about it, the more I realized their mistake. They bet that I would accept, that I would shrink, that I would resign myself. They didn't bet on my persistence, not even in my memory. I began to mentally rehearse what I would say when the right time came. It would not be an emotional confrontation. It would be factual, direct, the way I always was when I needed to be heard. I imagined their faces as they realized that I knew more than I appeared. I didn't feel pleasure in it, just an almost ethical need. I couldn't allow them to rewrite my story while I was still alive to tell it. This wasn't just about me. It was about limits. In the afternoon, I received a short message from my son asking if I had thought better. I read it and didn't answer. For the first time, I didn't feel guilty about it. Silence was now choice, not submission. I put the phone in my bag and continued working on my papers. Every minute invested, there was a step out of the position they tried to put me in. I didn't need to run. They thought they had control of the weather. I knew I had the truth. At dusk, I sat on the porch and watched the sky change color. I felt a physical fatigue, but also an unexpected peace. I was scared, yes, but not paralyzed. There was something profoundly transformative about assuming that no one would come to save me. The responsibility was all mine. Strangely, it strengthened me. The woman they underestimated was there, whole, lucid, ready to act. And from that moment on, I would not pretend that I did not see. When night fell, I put everything away carefully. knowing exactly where each paper was. I went to bed feeling the weight of what was yet to come, but also the firmness of someone who recovers his own axis. They had a plan built on wrong assumptions. The main one was that I wouldn't do anything. I smiled in the dark, a discreet, almost sad smile. Little did they know that I was just getting started. I spent the night sleepless, with the feeling that something was about to happen, even without knowing exactly what. The truth I had gathered was no longer mine alone. It began to demand space, air, movement. I woke up before dawn and went straight to the documents, as if they were a map that I needed to review once more before the crossing. Each paper was in the right place. Each note made sense. Still, the emotional weight seemed greater than all that. Knowing the truth does not bring immediate relief. Sometimes it brings fear. I decided to look for someone outside the family, someone who wasn't emotionally involved. He didn't want empty advice nor excessive protection. It needed confirmation. I called an old acquaintance who worked on legal issues, someone I hadn't seen in years, but whom I had always trusted. I was direct. I explained the situation without dramatizing. As I spoke, I noticed how firm my voice was. That surprised me. On the other end of the line, his silence was too long to be reassuring. When he finally spoke, he confirmed what I already suspected. He said that the old document had legal weight, which could not simply be ignored. He also said that there were, yes, clear indications of manipulation in the most recent papers. Hearing this from someone else made reality gain definitive contours. It was not just my interpretation, nor the result of hurt. It was concrete. I thanked him, hung up, and sat for a few minutes, absorbing everything. The truth, now validated, seemed even more dangerous. I spent the rest of the morning in silence, organizing not only the papers, but my own limits. I knew that, from that point on, there would be no turning back. Revealing what I knew meant definitively breaking with the image of a complacent mother, of an easy woman to lead. It also meant facing the emotional consequences of it. I would lose something, maybe a lot. But she would also lose if she remained silent. That was the real choice. And there was no painless option. In the early afternoon, I received another message from my son. This time, the tone was less careful, more direct. He spoke of urgency, of solving it soon, of avoiding problems. I read those words as if reading a threat disguised as worry. I didn't answer. Instead, I felt something freeze inside me. They were speeding up because they knew that time was no longer playing in their favor. This confirmed to me that I was on the right track. Their haste was my silent proof. My daughter called shortly after. I answered. Her voice was tense, too controlled. He said I was making it harder than it needed to be. I asked calmly why the old document had never been mentioned. There was an abrupt silence. A silence that did not ask for interpretation, only acceptance. She changed the subject quickly, talked about stress, about me needing to rest. I hung up politely, but with a definite certainty. Omission was also a form of betrayal. I sat down at the table and stared at the document once more. There were no more doubts, only decisions. The truth is frightening because it demands action. It does not allow us to continue exactly as we are. I knew that by revealing it, not only would their plan collapse, but the entire family dynamic would be exposed. This saddened me deeply. I didn't want to beat anyone. I just wanted to exist without being erased. Still, I understood that some truths only appear when someone is willing to break the silence. I started to prepare everything for the right moment. I separated copies, highlighted important passages, organized clear arguments. It would not be an impulsive confrontation. It would be necessary, almost surgical. As I did this, I felt a knot in my stomach, but also a strange serenity. I wasn't doing anything wrong. On the contrary, I was defending something basic, my right to decide about my own life. That gave me enough strength to keep going. In the evening, I sat alone in the living room and watched the house in silence. I thought about how many stories those walls held, how many choices, how many sacrifices. All of that was at stake now, not as material possessions, but as symbols of who I was and still was. The truth I carried was frightening because I dismantled convenient versions, but it also liberated. And I knew that, from that moment on, I could no longer retreat. When night came, I put the documents in the bag I would use the next day. He didn't know exactly how the confrontation would happen, only that it was close. I lay down feeling the weight of a decision that would change everything. The fear was still there, but it no longer controlled me. The truth had ceased to be just discovered. Now, it was ready to be said. The day dawned heavy, as if the air had thickened during the night. I left the house with my bag firmly on my shoulder, feeling the weight of the documents more than the weight of the leather. Every step to the car felt definitive, and it gave me strange butterflies in my stomach. I wasn't going anywhere specific, but I needed to get out. I needed to breathe outside those walls that already knew too much. As I drove, I thought about how serious everything had become too fast. There was no more room for pretense. It didn't take long for the phone to ring. My son. I answered, keeping my voice neutral, as if nothing was happening. He asked where I was, in a casual tone that didn't deceive. He said he needed to talk to me in person, that it couldn't wait any longer. There was something different about the way he spoke, a rigidity disguised as urgency. I replied that I would speak when it was convenient. The silence on the other side was short, but fraught. I knew it wouldn't end there. Later, I found a long, carefully written message filled with words like family, concern, and consequences. He talked about difficult processes, emotional exhaustion, how everything could be avoided if I collaborated. There was no explicit threat, but the subtext was clear. That was not a request. It was a warning. I felt a tightness in my chest, not of fear, but of disappointment. That was what was left between us. Strategies and emotional pressure. When I returned home, I found my daughter sitting on the porch, as if she was waiting for me. I had not agreed on anything. She smiled slightly, but her eyes were tired, hard. She said she needed to talk, that she was worried about me. I invited her in. We sat across from each other, and for a moment I almost believed that she was finally going to be honest. But the words that came were the same as always, packed into a softer tone. He said that I was making everything difficult, that I needed to trust them. I asked her directly if she knew about the old document. She hesitated. That hesitation was the clearest answer I could receive. He said he didn't remember well, that it was a thing of the past. I spoke of the dates, the signatures, the obvious contradiction. She took a deep breath and asked me to stop. I said that messing with it would only bring problems, that I would end up alone. The phrase was suspended in the air like a barely disguised threat. Alone. That's what they believed would paralyze me. After she left, I sat in the living room feeling deeply tired. The threats did not come with shouts or aggressiveness. They came wrapped up in care, in forced worry. That was what made everything more cruel. They used my own affections as a tool of control. But, interestingly, that also made me more sure that I was right. Those who are sure of their position do not need to put pressure. Their insistence revealed the fear they were trying to hide. In the late afternoon, I received a formal, almost impersonal email, talking about deadlines and procedures. I immediately recognized the attempt to intimidate me with technical language. I read everything calmly, without haste. This time, I felt no confusion or despair. I just recorded each word as another piece of the puzzle. They were moving too fast. And those who run usually make mistakes. I closed the computer and took a deep breath, feeling a strange serenity wash over me. In the evening, I sat down at the table and reviewed everything once again, not out of insecurity, but out of preparation. The veiled threats had a clear objective, to make me give up before the plan came to light. But it was too late for that. I had already crossed an invisible point. The fear still existed, but now it walked beside me, not in front of me, and that made all the difference. Before going to sleep, I looked out the bedroom window and thought about how that silent battle had transformed everything. The house, the children, the very idea of family. Nothing was simple anymore. Still, there was a harsh but liberating clarity. They tried to push me into the corner, scare me with emotional losses. They didn't realize that I was already dealing with the greatest loss of all, the illusion. And after that, few threats still had real force. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of grief. It wasn't for someone who had died, but for something I was about to lose for good. The truth has this silent cost. It demands goodbyes before it is even said. I got up slowly, feeling my body heavy, and sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes, taking a deep breath. I knew that from then on, there would be no more room for comfortable pretense. Whatever happened, I couldn't go back. I prepared the coffee almost on automatic, watching the kitchen as if it were the last time I saw her like that. Each object seemed to carry a memory that now hurt more than before. I thought about how that house had been built with effort, choices, and renunciations. All of this was at stake, not only in a material sense, but in a symbolic sense. Defending my truth meant risking losing the little coexistence that still existed. It was unfair, but real. And I needed to accept that in order to move forward. I received a call from the lawyer indicated by my acquaintance. I made an appointment for that same day, feeling my heart racing as I wrote down the time. I didn't tell anyone. That decision was mine alone. As I hung up, I noticed that my hands were shaking slightly, not of doubt, but of accumulated tension. I was putting myself in a position I never imagined occupying, that of someone who needs to protect himself from his own family. This observation was too harsh to ignore. On the way to the meeting, I thought about my children when they were little, how I taught them to tell the truth, even when it was difficult. I remembered conversations about responsibility, character, consequence. The irony of the situation tightened my chest. At what point had these values been lost? Or did they never disappear? They were just used conveniently? I didn't find answers. Just a heavy emptiness, accompanied by the certainty that I was doing the right thing, even if it didn't bring immediate comfort. The conversation with the lawyer was objective, almost cold. He confirmed everything I already knew, and added something that made me gulp. If I didn't act, I could lose the right to act later. Time was not only playing against them, he also played against me. Hearing this made everything more urgent, more concrete. I left the office with a briefcase in my hands and an even greater weight in my heart. Defending the truth meant assuming a formal, public, irreversible conflict. When I got home, I found unread messages on the phone. I didn't open any. I knew the content even before reading it. Demands, attempts at persuasion, perhaps more disguised threats. I put the device aside and sat alone in the living room. For the first time, I felt real fear. Not of what they could legally do, but of the approaching emotional breakup. I was about to cross a line that would put me on the other side of what I had always called family. I cried in silence, not out of weakness but out of exhaustion. I cried for what I was, for what I imagined we would be, for the future that was now drawn in such a different way. The truth did not promise happy endings, only honest endings, and that required strength. When the tears stopped, I felt a bitter clarity wash over me. I was paying a high price, but not an unfair one. Remaining silent would be even more costly. I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing everything that would be necessary for the next step. Every document separated, every detail revised. There was no more room for improvisation. As I did so, I realized something curious. Despite the pain, I didn't feel regretful. The suffering came from the emotional loss, not from the decision itself. It gave me a strange sense of peace. I was aligned with myself, perhaps for the first time in a long time. At dusk, I sat on the porch and watched the street in silence. People passed by. Lives went on normally, oblivious to the internal earthquake I faced. I thought about how lonely the truth often is. It does not gather crowds. It does not receive immediate applause, but it does. I took a deep breath, feeling the fresh night air, and accepted that this was the price I would have to pay. The truth would cost me relationships, comfort, and illusions. Still, I was ready to follow through to the end. This is the hardest part to share, the one I hesitated to say out loud. To speak of this means to admit the real cost of choosing the truth, relationships that do not return, silences that remain. If you've come this far with me, it's because you understand that some stories don't ask for comfort. They ask for presence. Sign up, not as a support for me, but as a gesture so that voices like this continue to exist, even when telling the truth comes at a price. The meeting took place 2 days later, in a room too neutral for any comfort. It wasn't my home, nor theirs. Maybe that's why I felt strangely firm when I entered. My son was already there, sitting with a rigid posture, accompanied by someone I recognized as a lawyer. My daughter arrived soon after, avoiding my gaze. No one asked how I was. That confirmed everything I needed to know. I was not there as a mother, but as an obstacle. I sat calmly, putting the bag on my lap. I felt the weight of the documents inside, almost comforting. My son started the conversation with that tone that mixed impatience and false cordiality. He said he hoped I had thought better, that there was still time to solve everything in a simple way. I didn't respond immediately. I waited for him to finish, watching every gesture, every pause. They were overconfident. Confident because they believed that I was still playing defensively. When I finally spoke, my voice came out firmer than I expected. He said that he had reviewed all the documents, old and recent. Their lawyer raised his eyebrows slightly, as if he didn't expect that. My son tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand, a simple, direct gesture. I kept talking, mentioning specific dates, ignored clauses, signatures that didn't match. The air in the room changed. Their security began to crack in silence. I took the old document out of my bag and placed it on the table, slowly sliding it to the center. There was a moment of absolute silence. My daughter looked at the paper as if she were seeing a ghost. The lawyer leaned forward, reading carefully. My son was immobile, too rigid. I didn't have to say much. The role spoke for me. What had been ignored for years now occupied the space it always deserved. I explained with almost clinical calm the context in which that document had been signed. She said she was lucid, conscious, and fully informed. There was no room for doubt. Every word of mine seemed to remove another brick from the plan they had built. The lawyer cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. He asked for a few minutes to analyze more carefully. My son tried to argue, but his voice no longer had the same strength. For the first time, he seemed lost. My daughter finally spoke up, saying that it didn't have to come to that. There was something broken in her voice, but it wasn't regret. It was fear. Fear that everything would come to light. I stared at her for a few seconds before answering. I said that point had been reached the moment they decided to act without me. The silence that followed was heavy, definitive. There was no more room for pretense. Their lawyer was the first to admit that there was a serious problem. He said that that document completely changed the scenario. His words sounded like a silent verdict. I saw my son grit his teeth, unable to hide his frustration. I didn't feel a victory. I felt a bitter relief, mixed with sadness. That exhibition was not a personal triumph. It was the confirmation that I had been consciously betrayed. When the meeting ended, no one tried to approach. There was no apology, no attempt at reconciliation, just avoided glances and hurried to leave. I sat for a few seconds after everyone stood up, taking a deep breath. My body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the accumulated emotional discharge. I had told the truth. He had put everything out in the open, and that, in itself, changed everything. As I left the room, I felt the weight of what was to come next. Their plan was exposed, but the consequences were still to be drawn. I walked to the car with slow steps, feeling the sun hit my face. It was strange to realize that the most dreaded moment had passed, and that, despite the pain, I was still whole. The exposure did not destroy me. On the contrary, she gave me back something I thought I had lost, the certainty that my voice still mattered. The following days were eerily quiet. No call, no message, no attempt to contact them. It was as if, after the exhibition, everyone was recalculating routes, assessing damage. I felt the impact of this silence in an ambiguous way. On the one hand, there was relief. On the other, an even clearer loneliness. Their plan had been interrupted, but the void left by it was real. The house seemed quieter than ever, as if it were also processing what had happened. I received official confirmation a few days later. The process they had started was suspended, and any future attempts would need to be reevaluated in light of the old document. Reading those words was like watching an entire structure collapse without making a sound. Years of planning, manipulation, and certainty had been dismantled by something they believed was unimportant, a forgotten role, an ignored detail. I felt no satisfaction, just a cold observation. They lost because they underestimated time and truth. My son showed up at home at the end of that week, unannounced. I opened the door and saw him there, different. Less confident, more rigid. He didn't hug me. She didn't call me mom. He only said that he needed to speak. I invited him in, feeling a knot form in his stomach. He tried to explain, justify, say that everything had gotten out of control. He spoke of intention, protection, communication errors. I listened to it all in silence, knowing that those words came too late. When he finished, I asked him if he ever thought of asking me what I wanted. The question was suspended between us. He looked away as he had done before. That was the answer. There was no real regret, only frustration that it didn't work out. This realization hurt more than the betrayal itself, because it revealed something irreversible. The relationship I believed existed was not the same for both of us. My daughter didn't come. He sent a short message saying he needed time. I understood what that meant. The plan had collapsed, but the damage would remain. They didn't just lose a strategy. They lost the version of me that accepted everything in silence. Perhaps this would be more difficult to deal with than any legal consequences. For me, it meant accepting that not all truth reconstructs. Some only expose what was already broken. I started to observe their reaction as if observing something from the outside. There were tensions between them now, subtle accusations, barely concealed discomforts. The unit that supported the plan had disappeared. This confirmed something important to me. Their alliance was never based on care, but on convenience. Once broken, there was nothing to keep it standing. That brought me no consolation, closure only. Internally, I was also falling apart, but in a different way. There was no more fear, only tiredness, a deep, existential tiredness. I had won the factual battle, but I had lost the illusion of belonging, and that required mourning. I spent days in silence, respecting this process. I didn't try to rush anything. Some losses need to be felt in their entirety, so that they do not return as open wounds. As time went on, I began to reorganize my life in a practical way. Pending issues, documents, small decisions that once seemed insignificant now had another weight. I did everything calmly, without rushing, without consulting anyone. Each choice, no matter how small, was an exercise in recovered autonomy. Their plan had fallen apart. Now I needed to build something new in the place. At the end of that week, I sat alone in the living room, observing the same space where so many conversations had taken place. Nothing there had changed physically, but everything was different. Silence was now not imposed. He was chosen. The plan that had taken years to build had collapsed in a few moments. And along with him, the false versions they created about me also collapsed. What was left was not comfort, but truth. And at that moment, this needed to be enough. In the days that followed, I experienced a strange feeling of empty victory. Everything I had feared didn't happen, at least not in the way I imagined. I didn't lose my home, nor my autonomy, nor my lucidity. But I missed something quieter, difficult to explain. The idea of family that I carried for decades did not resist the confrontation with the truth. I knew I had won on the concrete level, but emotionally I seemed to have come out of a war without knowing exactly what to celebrate. My son didn't come back to me after that conversation. No message, no apology, no gesture of trying. His absence hurt more than any discussion would have hurt. It was as if, by failing in the plan, he had also given up on the relationship. This realization accompanied me in small moments of the day, like a discreet but constant weight. I didn't cry about it anymore. There was a deep tiredness in place of tears. My daughter kept her distance. Sometimes I liked something I posted, a gesture too small to signify rapprochement, but big enough to confuse me. I thought about calling, trying to have a frank conversation, but I backed off. For the first time, I understood that not every bond needs to be saved at any cost. Some relationships only survive as long as someone accepts to diminish themselves. I was no longer willing to do that. And this decision, although painful, was necessary. I started to take care of the house in a different way. Not as someone who preserves something for others, but as someone who takes care of their own space. I reorganized closets, donated old things, threw away papers that no longer made sense. Each gesture was simple, but loaded with meaning. I was closing cycles, even without ceremony. The house seemed to respond to this, lighter, less oppressive. Maybe it was just projection, but I felt less of a visitor inside it. Some nights were more difficult. The silence bothered again, bringing back memories of times when everything seemed simpler. At those times, I allowed myself to feel sadness without trying to correct it. I learned that denying pain only prolongs it. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling and thought about how everything could have been different if the conversation had happened earlier, if there had been more honesty. But that kind of thinking no longer consumed me. It was just a statement, not regret. I received visits from acquaintances, neighbors, people who knew only parts of the story. Everyone said that I had been strong, brave. I was grateful, but I didn't feel that way. Strength for me was not raising my voice. It was to continue even without applause, even without family support. It was sustaining the decision when the emotional comfort disappeared. This kind of strength does not appear to others. It only reveals itself in silence. There were times when I wondered if it would have been easier to give in, accept everything, and preserve the appearance of harmony. The answer was always accompanied by a tightness in the chest. Maybe it would have been easier, yes, but it would not have been possible. I would have disappeared little by little, swallowed up by other people's decisions. This awareness gave me back a kind of bitter peace. I was whole, even if it meant being alone. As the weeks went by, I began to notice small internal changes. I spoke more firmly, made plans without consulting anyone, trusted my own judgment again. It was not euphoria, nor enthusiasm. It was stability, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The victory I had won was not celebrable, but it was solid. It didn't bring me immediate joy, but it did bring me ground. On an ordinary afternoon, sitting in the living room, I realized that I no longer thought about what they were doing or planning. This absence of concern was almost a scare. For so long, my attention was focused on avoiding losses, conflicts, displeasure. Now, she was starting to turn to me. This quiet change was perhaps the greatest achievement of all. There was no party, no recognition, just an internal displacement. Victory did not feel like victory because it did not rebuild what was broken, but it gave me back something more essential, the possibility of going on without asking permission. And at that moment, that was enough. I hadn't recovered everything. There were irreversible losses. Still, I was standing, conscious, owner of my story. And I began to accept that some victories don't come to make us smile, but to allow us to continue. The fresh start didn't come with big decisions or dramatic changes. He insinuated himself little by little, in almost invisible gestures, waking up and choosing what to do with your day without telling anyone, deciding lunch without considering other people's preferences, walking through the house feeling that each space belonged to me again. It wasn't happiness, but it was autonomy. And at that moment in my life, this had immense value. I started to organize my days with a simplicity that previously seemed impossible. I created small new routines, not to fill voids, but to make a presence. A short walk in the morning, the unhurried reading in the afternoon, the care of the garden that I had neglected. Each activity was a silent reminder that I was still there, whole. He didn't need to prove anything to anyone. Just existing was enough. The relationship with my children remained distant. There was no sudden reconciliation, no late requests, sometimes a neutral message, a polite formality. It hurt to accept that maybe that was the most we could have, but I learned not to insist where there was no reciprocity. Love should not be a space for constant negotiation. This understanding came with sadness, but also with maturity. I no longer needed to explain myself. There were difficult days when loneliness seemed heavier. At those times, I allowed myself to feel in no hurry to overcome. Life does not require happy endings, only honest endings. And mine was being built like this, without emotional makeup. I began to understand that rebuilding is not going back to what it was, but accepting what it has become. This acceptance did not come all at once. It was a daily, silent, patient exercise. I rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant for years. Old tastes, strong opinions, simple desires. I realized that over time I molded myself to fit the expectations of others, until I almost disappeared. Now, without realizing it, I was expanding again. Not to occupy more space in the world, but to occupy my own space with truth. This brought a new kind of dignity, quieter, firmer. Some people moved away, others came closer. I didn't overanalyze these changes. I let them happen. I learned that not every loss is a failure, just as not every permanence is a victory. What mattered was the coherence between what I felt and what I experienced. For the first time in a long time, these two things began to go together. I kept the old document in a definitive folder, not as a weapon, but as a symbol. It represented more than legal evidence. It represented my lucidity, my memory, my ability not to be erased. Knowing that he was there brought me security, but not resentment. I didn't need to revisit it often. It was enough to know that it existed. Some truths do not need to be repeated to remain valid. On a quiet afternoon, sitting on the porch, I realized that I was thinking less about the past and more about the present. That surprised me. Time has not cured everything, but it has reorganized. The wounds were there, less open, less dominant. I no longer defined myself by the betrayal I suffered, but by the response I gave to her. And that response was to stay true to myself, even when it cost me dearly. The end of my story was not grandiose, nor inspiring to the outside eye. There was no complete reconciliation, no perfect emotional justice. But there was truth, autonomy, and continuity. I rebuilt my life without fanfare, without applause, without revenge. I just followed. And in that silence that once frightened me, I found something unexpected, enough peace to continue living my way. If something about this story has touched you, it's because it connects to situations that go beyond me, patterns of silence, control, and erasure that still replay in many families and relationships. Share this video not for engagement, but so that it reaches someone who may be experiencing something similar and can't name it yet. Sometimes sharing is a simple act of solidarity, a way of saying, "You're not alone. I'll stay here," reading each comment carefully. Tell me, from which city and country are you watching? And what about this story stayed with you? Knowing that these words reach someone really matters more than you think.